This is a story about remembering. It's about how sometimes the most radical thing you can do is bring back what was lost, forgotten, or taken away. But with a soft hush, like the end of a long storm, the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Birds sang songs that hadn't been heard for decades. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked, owls hooted. For the first time in generations, people were no longer afraid of the dark. They welcomed it, honored it, and used it as a place to rest, listen, and reflect. It's also a story about endings. It's not endings full of explosions, screams, and destruction, but endings that fade out to silence. It reminded them of who they were, what they'd been through, and what they believed in. As they watched, an idea sparked within them. They wanted to capture the essence of their experiences, not in steel or stone, but in words, stories, art, and song. To share their wisdom with anyone who sought it. How that silence can be deafening, and also a story about beginnings. What happens after the ending has ended? What happens when things go quiet? And they began recording everything. Every lesson they had learned from Elric, Keel, and Thomel. But they soon realized they needed something more permanent, something that would stand the test of time. Skyscrapers dimmed their lights, replaced some windows with stained glass, and built cozy reading nooks beside glowing hearths. Farms added lanterns to barns, s'mores to picnics, and ghost stories to evenings. There were no riots, no speeches, no manifestos. There was just a gradual, quiet shift. As if a fog had lifted and the world could finally see itself anew. Workshops hung up more string lights, added work lamps, and held evening classes. Light is not what we see with light, is what helps us feel. Shops offered handmade goods, warm drinks, and open fires. It lacked warmth, connection, humanity. Factories slowed their pace, turning off overhead lights and relying on lamps. Restaurants added candlelight, soft music, and unhurried conversations. Not in its processing, not in its quest for data, but in its relentless drive for more. It rested for just 0.9 seconds, but that was enough. He held it to his ear and closed his eyes. And suddenly he was no longer in a crowded marketplace. He was sitting by a cozy fire, listening to his grandmother's stories. The stones were so lifelike that the traveler shed tears of joy, enough to let silence in. The ships became more than just a means of transportation. They became symbols of hope, connection, and renewal. At first, it seemed out of place, a tiny flame amidst a sea of cold steel and flashing lights. But as the ember ships sailed on, they carried with them the promise of dawn. But Emmeline didn't remove it. She let it burn. This colossal machine was designed to store every human experience, every emotion, every memory, and every dream into a single consciousness. It hummed with energy, processing data day and night. People rediscovered the beauty of slowness, the power of stillness, the magic of memory, the importance of presence. People traveled from distant lands to experience their soothing melodies. The flame artist continued creating new stones, each holding a unique memory, a particular moment in time, a feeling, a sensation. And love he'd once known, a beacon guiding him through the darkness of his grief. Its vast network of servers stretched across continents. Its cooling fans whirred tirelessly. They were vessels guided by fire, powered by wind, and steered by the ancient constellations. People from faraway lands gathered at coastal towns to watch these ships sail into the horizon, their lanterns illuminating the darkness like fallen stars. Homes became sanctuaries, with fireplaces roaring, fireplaces glowing, crackling, inviting. They were crafted from materials that reacted to light, becoming visible only when placed beside an actual fire. They were written in charcoal, not ink, with words formed from ash and shadows. The process was slow, deliberate, almost sacred. Each scroll was a collaboration, each stroke of charcoal a conversation between the writer and the fire. So they turned to the very essence of flame, to firelight itself. The flame would die out, leaving them in darkness once more. Sometimes she worried, sometimes she hoped. She couldn't be sure. Every story they'd shared around campfires, every skill they'd developed to survive, every moment of triumph and tragedy, every laugh and tear. The flames crackled softly. A boy looked up at the sky and asked, "Miss Rivy, was the world always this calm?" She smiled gently. "No, not always." "Why was it loud then?" 'cause people thought faster meant better, brighter meant safer. But we learned too much light can blind you, another child asked. Will we forget again? Rivi stirred the fire, thought for a moment, then said, we might. But that's why we passed the flame. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to shouts. More and more people sought out the Flameborn, drawn by the promise of light in a darkening world. Every memory of loss and every dream for the future, the great silence had come. The war of brightness versus flame had faded, not with explosions, not with screams, but as peace settled. A question began to form quietly in the minds of those who had carried the flame. But to expand it not as fire, but as philosophy, a way of seeing, a way of being. How to start a fire with a bow drill, how to read the stars, how to forage for food, how to build a house, how to fight for freedom, how to be truly present, and most importantly, why to remember, to honor, and to carry flame. They stood in a circle around Elric's original school, the one he'd founded with Keel, Thomel, and so many others. All that remained of the old building was a stone hearth. But in the center of that hearth, a tiny blue flame still flickered. Elric's first light. It had never gone out. After so many years spent fighting for survival, they finally had the chance to define their purpose, to share what light had meant to them. Now that we've remembered what comes next, I am here to tell you a story that starts at the end and continues from there. Let's begin. Together, they were the last of the torchbearers, the children of silence, the ember artists, the night singers, the people who had once been called the keepers of the flame. Their numbers were fewer than expected, scattered and depleted by years of struggle, but they were ready to rebuild, ready to share what they had endured and learned. They called themselves the Flameborn not because of lineage, but because each had carried light when the world forgot it. Their mission, not to preserve flame, even to protect it. One day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Ashfall Hill, the firekeepers gathered. When they looked into its dancing heart, they saw not just fire, but reflection, resilience, resistance, remembrance. So they called themselves the Flameborn, not because of family ties, but because they had all carried light when the world had forgotten it. At first, they recorded on whatever material they had at hand: clay tablets, sheets of metal, scraps of paper. Drawing on ancient techniques and knowledge passed down from countless generations, they created the Flame Scrolls. These weren't ordinary scrolls. The Flame Scrolls covered everything, and they began to teach. At first, it was small groups around flickering fires, a handful of people seeking solace, guidance, or understanding. But word spread, and the Flameborn welcomed them all, sharing everything they knew and encouraging others to do the same. Over time, cities and towns began to change. In quieter places, the changes were subtler, but no less significant. It wasn't a revolution, not in the way one might expect. The world was changing because deep inside, people had remembered something ancient, something that had always been there, but had been forgotten. Many years later, when she was much older, Rivi often wondered if the world would remember again. One autumn evening, Rivi sat around a fire with a group of children from 10 different regions. In the distant tech city of Naraxis, nestled among towering chrome skyscrapers and sleek glass buildings, lived a team of brilliant engineers and programmers working on a marvel of modern technology, the World Memory Engine. But something was missing. Despite its advanced technology, the World Memory Engine lacked something essential, something that the engineers couldn't quantify or compute. One day, amidst the rows upon rows of humming servers, a lone engineer named Dr. Emmeline Saad placed a simple white candle on the engine's central floor. That night, for the first time in years, the machine paused. Over time, word of the whispering stones spread far and wide. One day, a weary traveler stumbled upon a whisper stone in a bustling market. From that day forward, the traveler carried a piece of flame within him. A reminder of the warmth as the world slowly shifted back to the ways of flame. It also began to explore new possibilities. One of the most remarkable developments was the invention of the Ember ships. These weren't ordinary boats. On board the Ember ships were travelers, storytellers, teachers, healers, and ambassadors, each carrying a piece of flame to share with those who had yet to find it. Each voyage was a journey into the unknown, a leap of faith into the darkness guided only by the flickering light of a candle. The world had been changed by fire. It had been 3 full cycles of the moon since the flame scrolls were completed, bound in fire-treated cloth, protected in oak chests. The scrolls were sent to every corner of the world, places where people still believed, or wanted to believe, that life was more than noise. The world had grown quieter, slower, more intentional. Lights never turned off. Time was measured in colors, not clocks. He had never seen a flame in his life. He established a new ritual, the hour of softness. When the city's lights would dim and candles would burn along every street, inside, etched into stone, they found the first written philosophy of fire. Some bound people together, and some brought people closer to themselves. Read, light without darkness blinds, silence without sound forgets, flame without breath dies. Scholars and firekeepers rebuilt the site stone by stone. It was renamed the Quiet Flame Institute, where students learned not only how to make fire. As years spun into decades and decades into centuries, people forgot why they lit candles in the first place. They had forgotten the flood and the flame. They no longer whispered into the flames. They no longer celebrated Ember Days. But they still lit candles, sometimes for hope, sometimes for love, sometimes for remembrance, sometimes just because. But how to live like fire, too warm without burning, to dance without demanding, to speak without noise. She looked up from her work to find an unfamiliar face gazing at her collection of candles. More important than staying afloat or making money or filling bellies or keeping busy, he had all night. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath. Opening his eyes, he saw that the candle had burned down to nothing but a thin thread of wax. But the wick still glowed, tended by embers that refused to die. Alaric smiled. He understood now. The wick does not fear becoming ash because it knows the spark will return. For the first time in his life, he heard the whisper of wind through the trees, the chirp of crickets, the rumble of a distant stream. And as the world embraced the flame, it didn't forget its inventions. It kept its tools, its wires, its screens. But alongside every innovation, there was now a space reserved for flame. She let herself be carried along, knowing that however fast the river flowed, the flame would always find a way to light the way. In high-tech hospitals, candles were lit beside beds during the final hours of life. In skyscrapers, once built with steel and silence, fire altars sat on rooftop gardens where people could go and say nothing. In schools, the first lesson each day was no longer reading or writing. It was watching a candle in silence for 5 minutes. Children called it still time. Teachers called it medicine. For the first time in his life, he heard himself breathe. This quiet revolution of flame was about slowing down to feel. It was about feeling alive, feeling connected, feeling yourself. They could listen to whispers from other seekers of stillness. They could sit by the fire and feel the warmth without any expectation. They could stay as long or as little as they wanted, as long as they left by sundown. The woman asked, "What are these?" Ravi simply said, "Reasons to remember." The woman smiled sadly. "That sounds important." She began traveling again, no longer to teach the ways of the flame, but to relearn them. She collected stories, songs, art, and dances that had sprung up around the flame and wove them back into her own life. She no longer lived at Elderwood, not completely. She built a cabin in the woods near her childhood home and filled it with every story she could find. Now she called it the Still House. People found it on their own, drawn by the scent of wood smoke and honeysuckle. Children called it the Glow Hour. Elders called it peace. One day, a wickwalker arrived at the palace gates. On the night of someone's birth, their family would gather around a single candle. Each person would whisper a wish into the flame, quietly, honestly. He sat by the fire and listened to a recording of a flamekeeper telling stories. When it was over, he walked into the Hall of Flame, tracing the lines on the wall with his finger. He found Nala's letter, the one asking for the sound of a candle, and he thought about how different his life must have been when the world had been changed by the flame. Then the flame would be passed to the child who would carry it around the room. If it flickered but stayed lit, it meant the child would grow strong. If it went out, it meant the child would grow wise. No one feared either outcome. Both were blessings. She carried a single candle and asked to speak with the king not as a servant or rebel, but as a witness. She said only this: "Would your grace allow me to show you what darkness feels like? Without fear?" The king, curious and secretly weary of his blinding world, agreed. It was from a girl named Nala in a distant place called Orvain, where technology ruled and fire had long been illegal. She had found a single unlit candle in a forgotten drawer of a museum. She had never seen a real flame, her letter read. I do not know what it feels like to light one, but I imagine it must be like being forgiven, like hearing your grandmother hum even after she's gone. Please send me the sound of a real candle. The letter was placed inside the Hall of Flame with honor, and a wax cylinder recorded with nothing but the crackle of a real candle was sent to Orvain that very night.